Is Dan McClellan's data dogma? Say that 3 times fast. Hi, my name is Dr. Jordan Koss, and this is the Millennial Harbinger channel.
And here we go.
So I stopped by a privately owned bookstore the other day when I was at one of my daughter's soccer tournaments out of town, and found Dan McClellan's latest book, The Bible Says So. Sounds like Peter Enns' book, but it's just a slightly different title. And in it, he's got a whole chapter 14, on the subject of homosexuality. And some initial observations after reading that chapter, particularly where he discusses Romans chapter 1, is that he only wrote 6 paragraphs within chapter 14 on his take and interpretation on Romans 1. And the title of that chapter itself was The Bible Says Homosexuality is an Abomination. But after my initial reaction to those 6 paragraphs is like, this isn't a serious treatment. As a result of it not being a serious treatment, the book overall is written for the everyday Christian person in the pew, if you will, to use that idiom. It's not meant to, I guess, in some sense, be convincing to somebody who's kind of had the academic training. It's meant to be convincing to somebody who hasn't had academic training. So I've gotten this response from other authors who've written on Romans 1. And I would expect by, after expressing my non-affirming response, to hear back from perhaps an affirming author that, hey, there's so much more to back this up than what's in this chapter. And sure, you could put more into it, but he succinctly summarized the affirming take on Romans 1, at least his affirming take on Romans 1. And my response to that response would be, but even still, I find the affirming interpretation and take wanting, but I'm kind of disappointed. It was only 6 paragraphs, and a pretty light 6 paragraphs at that. And we'll get into that in a minute. But overall, there was nothing really new in Dan's take and interpretation on Romans 1, maybe nuanced from others a little bit, but pretty much nothing new.
I like that.
But what I'm going to do here is I'm going to go paragraph by paragraph, read one of the 6 paragraphs, and then respond to it with some thoughts. You ready? Okay, here we go. Paragraph 1. Paragraph 1 says, what were the Gentiles doing that was so bad? Well, that brings us to Romans. In chapters 1 through 3, Paul develops an argument that culminates in the statement that both Jewish folks and Greeks are under the power of sin. The point is to argue that both Greeks as well as Jewish folks need the good news. Paul starts off in chapter 1 condemning the Greeks for their depravity, just to get Jewish listeners stoked so he can turn the tables on them in chapter 2 by pointing out the law leaves them no better off, particularly if they're so excited about the passing judgment on the Greeks. What are my thoughts here on chapter 1? Well, I'd say this. Chapter 1, or not chapter 1, but the first paragraph of the 6 paragraphs, is that he's briefly trying to summarize Romans 1 through 3, and it leaves something to be desired because he's trying to be very, very, very succinct, too simplistic. So I'm kind of like, But he takes the Greek view of the target audience of Paul's words in Romans 1, 18 through 32. So he takes the Greek/Gentile view, whereas most affirming authors will, at least that I've seen, will take that same view. So it's kind of a tell by taking that view of the target audience that he's going to have an affirming take. Most people already know that going into the book, but that's a tell. It's one of the many assumptions that he takes as obvious fact, when in reality it's not. I think the better argument can be made based upon references and source text that Paul is pulling into his argument there in Romans 1 and 2, that Jews could very well be that target audience, or a mixture of Jew and Gentiles, or all humanity is a target audience in Romans 1, 18 to 32. But those are a few initial thoughts based upon paragraph 1.
I want to hit him.
Let's go to paragraph 2. Paragraph 2 says, Paul's condemnation of Greek depravity builds on the idea of natural theology, the idea that one can gather enough data just from observing nature to understand the true God and how God expects to be worshipped. Being keen observers of nature, the Greeks have been exposed to God, but instead of appropriately worshiping him, the Greeks worship images of humans and animals, putting the created over the creator. Paul thinks they should know better, and so they're without excuse. As a result, he says in verse 26, God handed them over to dishonorable passions. The idea here seems to be that there is normally a kind of ceiling or limit on the passion that God allowed humans to experience. Because the Greeks rejected him, God decided to remove that ceiling and let their passions run wild. Okay, what can we get from paragraph 2? First thing here is he seems to be diving into natural theology, which he says, hey, Paul's doing this, and he's diving into natural theology because I think that is probably one, if not the top arguments that conservative, non-affirming evangelical Christians use in response to affirming takes on Romans 1. So he's trying to basically, like others have tried to do, show how the natural theology argument is really nothing at all, not legitimate, not credible. So he says Paul builds his argument against the Greeks using natural theology, and Dan attacks this idea, again, like I said, because conservative evangelicals keep emphasizing this aspect of Romans 1 the most, even though I think they shouldn't either. But I don't think they should for a different reason. And I've made a video on that, I believe. But also in this paragraph, he takes a moralized view of handed over, which is disappointing. Apparently, I don't know if he's aware of Beverly Gaventa's work on paradidomy and handed over, but I'm disappointed that he just simply glossed over this important word in this passage and totally moralized it. Oh well.
Fine.
Paragraph number 3 begins at the bottom of page 179. Paul's leading example of the detestable results of this rebellion is the only reference to female same-sex intercourse anywhere in the Bible. He says their women exchange their natural usefulness for what is unnatural, and many translations here will render natural relations or natural intercourse, but the word is usefulness. And here the idea seems to be intercourse can only involve a kind of counterfeit penetration, and because Paul doesn't sound very creative, the genitals are not being used for their natural or intended purpose. It's one of the many kind of pejorative shots that Dan takes at Paul for whatever reason. He's not very respectful towards Paul, it seems. This actually reflects a pretty widespread prejudice in this time period, Dan says. Across the Greco-Roman world, female same-sex intercourse was more widely condemned than male same-sex intercourse. Women who engaged in same-sex intercourse were referred to with a pejorative term that was based on the verbal root to rub. So what can we say about paragraph 3? Well, this paragraph is about female same-sex intercourse. And he says Paul is, again, not very creative and is kind of communicating a very widespread prejudice in this time period. So not only is he kind of like taking a shot at Paul in one way by saying he's not very creative, but he's also taking another shot at Paul by saying Paul's prejudiced here. I question Dan's view on Paul's inspired nature as an apostle of Jesus Christ, based upon his overall take on Romans 1 in general. But that prejudice that Dan says that Paul has here and communicates is that lesbian sex was counterfeit penetration, or their genitals were not being used for their natural or intended purpose. And what Dan is doing here is that he's gearing up for his social conventions argument, saying, hey, Paul is just taking a social convention of the day, which he believed as well, to make an argument against homosexuality. But don't fret, Paul made a mistake there. Paul's prejudiced. Because we can today understand that we know those things aren't true that Paul believed back then. Therefore, we can understand that as a result, it's okay to be in a same-sex sexual relationship. But we'll get into the social conventions argument. a little bit more here in a minute. But this is just one of the nuanced arguments against Paul's verbiage, or saying that, this is somewhat like Matthew Vines's excessive lust reading, but different. It's different, but it's similar.
They think of us as a passé, archaic institution.
Okay, let's go to paragraph number 4. But Paul's not really in a position to dictate what is and isn't being done according to nature. Interesting. When he talks about nature, he's really talking about social conventions that get rationalized as natural. It's kind of like when people insist their intuitions about something are just common sense. The late Professor Robert Jewett, in his Hermeneia commentary on Romans, notes Paul is raising a cultural norm to the level of social convention, to the level of a natural and thus biological principle. The same confusion of social convention for what is nature dictates is going on in 1 Corinthians 11:13. There we go again, where Paul rhetorically asks, doesn't even nature itself teach that if a man wears long hair, it is dishonorable to him? No, Paul, it doesn't. There's more kind of disrespectful verbiage aimed at Paul here. That Dan, I don't know. Dan's got some issues with Paul. All right, so paragraph 4. What can we say about paragraph 4 here? Well, here's the social convention argument laid out for us. Dan says when he talks about nature, he's talking about social conventions that get rationalized as natural. So taking a social prejudice and saying, hey, this is common sense, this is true for all time, when in actuality it's not. Or another way of saying this is Paul takes his intuitions for what is natural and turns it into an objective fact that everybody should oh yeah, of course this is the case. He quotes Robert Jewett, references and quotes Robert Jewett in his Hermeneia commentary on Romans, who makes this same argument as well. A lot of affirming authors refer to Robert Jewett that I've seen. I got to get a hold of that commentary and do a video on that. But again, Dan just disrespectfully notes that Paul makes the same mistake in 1 Corinthians 11 as he did here in Romans 1. And I say, just like this affirming take on Romans 1 is inaccurate, I would say how 1 Corinthians 11 is totally dismissed because of this kind of argument about natural theology, this social convention view. I think it's totally misses the forest for the trees. There you go, another overused idiom. I've mentioned it in other videos, but Dr. Michael Heiser, has a podcast on 1 Corinthians 11 where he reads an article written by another scholar that gives us a better understanding of what Paul's trying to say in 1 Corinthians 11, and it's based off of the Enochic etiology of evil, not this kind of social convention view of natural theology.
Hanging on to outdated imperialist dogma.
All right, let's go to paragraph 5, I believe. Okay, satisfied that his readers will agree with his rhetoric to this point, Paul turns his attention to the men, arguing in verse 27 that in the same way, Greek men give up the natural usefulness of women and burn in their lust for one another. Again, the point is that a seemingly natural function of genitals is being set aside as the dishonorable passions of the Greeks are given free rein. Paul refers to men engaging in the shameless acts which results in Paul's imagination and them receiving in themselves the necessary recompense. It's not entirely clear what recompense, frequently translated penalty, Paul's referring to, but it's likely it has to do with the notion of some kind of unusual soreness that attends male same-sex intercourse. Others have argued it refers to the disease of feminization. Philo was big on that, or some kind of addiction or other pathology. Maybe he thought it made you go blind or caused hairy palms. There again is another snide, kind of disrespectful remark from Dan about Paul. All right, so what can we say about paragraph number 5? Johnny 5, give me Johnny 5. So here continues this male same-sex discussion on what Paul is trying to get at, continuing his social convention argument. So he applies the same social convention argument to Paul in his application to male homosexuality in paragraph 5. Again, a flippant and dismissive treatment based on the social convention assumption. It's an assumption. I don't think there's good evidence to be so adamant and sure about this way of reading Romans 1. And I don't really think there's much value in this paragraph other than furthering his disdain of Paul. And I don't know how the editor read this paragraph and said, you know what, this paragraph needs to stay, because there's not really much of any substance in this paragraph. I don't know. It really doesn't further his argument very much at all. Okay, so that's really all I have to say about paragraph 5.
Why limit yourself to one dogma?
Let's go on to the last paragraph on Romans chapter 1. So, in short, Dan says, Paul suggests that homosexual behavior is something that didn't occur among Jewish folks. That's arguable. But only among misguided Greeks unrestrained by God. Paul would also prefer people just didn't engage in sex at all, but is happy to make exceptions for those whose desire might bubble over and drive them to fornication. In those exceptions, it seems that Paul insisted sex be holy and honorable and without the passion of desire. He also suggests it should be sporadic and motivated by the desire to keep a tight lid on sexual desire. Paul's sexual ethic is obviously based on outdated social frameworks and inaccurate concepts of human sexuality. So is it even relevant today? And that seems like a rhetorical question. And the answer to his rhetorical question is no. And wow, man, let's talk about this. What are some of my thoughts on this final paragraph, which is like a summary of his take on Romans 1? Well, he says Paul is saying homosexual sex didn't occur among the Jews. Again, that is arguable. It's like it's in the Torah. So just as Israel acts like the nations all the time in terms of other things like idolatry, God put it in the Torah because perhaps like he didn't want his people to act like Gentiles and Greeks. And probably sometimes they did, So I don't know why you would take that view that homosexuality didn't occur among Jews. I don't know. That's just my thought. Dan has issues, it seems, with what he thinks Paul is saying about sexual ethics in general, not just about homosexuality, but about sexual ethics in general. And it's strange. I don't know, man. It's just strange. I want to kind of dive deeper into that in another video perhaps, but I don't know why he's so down on Paul and his perception of what Paul says about sexual ethics in general. And then finally, the last sentence in the summary paragraph, in paragraph 6, he says Paul's sexual ethic is obviously based on outdated social frameworks and inaccurate concepts of human sexuality. And there's his social conventions view. And wow, it's just like, so this is where a lot of people are at in academia. Like, this is why we can't have nice things. This is why, like, serving in ministry or teaching at a evangelical Christian school, if you even act a little bit smart, people think that you're like a Dan McClellan and you got to watch out. So you can't act too smart in church or as a Bible teacher in an evangelical Christian school. But man, again, these are assumptions that I don't think can be backed up with actual evidence. But Dan is communicating these assumptions as if they're obvious objective fact. And they're not. They're just not.
A hateful language and dogma from another world.
Okay. So final thoughts on Dan's take here on Romans chapter 1 in his new book, The Bible Says So. And hey, what do you know? Big surprise, surprise, Dan is disenchanted. He completely ignores the entire supernatural framework of Romans 1. He completely ignores any Old Testament text that Paul actually quotes and references within the passage. Why he does that, I have no idea. He just goes the whole, what is the context, Greco-Roman context of Rome at the time? And he just doesn't consider any Jewish background. Paul, he doesn't consider the Deuteronomy 32 worldview of Heider. He doesn't consider the Enochic teleology of evil, which is associated with the Deuteronomy 32 worldview. He doesn't consider Psalm 116. He doesn't consider Deuteronomy 4. Again, I don't know why. And thus, his reading is so disenchanted. It has nothing to do at all. It doesn't bring in any conversation of supernatural evil or how that might speak into the topic of sexual ethics and what Paul has to say about homosexuality here. I don't know. It questions, again, Dan questions Paul's apostolic inspiration and authority by how pejorative and disrespectful he is towards Paul's words on homosexuality and sexual ethics in general, and I just don't get that. I'm not in that academic world anymore. But as a result, he tries to dismantle the church history or historical interpretation argument with the social conventions view that says, hey, the church and Christians have understood it this way for 2,000 years. We shouldn't change it. So many affirming authors try to kind of say, hey, not really. Christians didn't really believe this way for the past 2,000 years. Or even if they did, they were just mistaken and wrong. And that's kind of arrogant, to say the least. One final view, the social convention view, again, says that if Paul was right, he was right temporarily within that cultural context, but now he's wrong. And silly Paul, now we know better. But the Enochic teleology of evil and the Deuteronomy 32 worldview, which I think form the greater foundation of Paul's argument here in Romans 1, more so than the Greco-Roman context that Paul is speaking into there in the city of Rome, shows us that what Paul's words are more permanent instead of temporary, are more foundational than they are currently wrong, that they're still true today as they were true in the first century, as they were true based upon what God gave Moses at Mount Sinai. But because Dan seems to be disenchanted in take on Romans 1, and who knows what his supernatural beliefs are in terms of the miracles, etc., that we find in the Bible, whether he agrees with that or doesn't, it raises a couple questions that I would like him to kind of talk about as well. But I think the better way, instead of the social conventions view, is to look at Romans 1 based upon Heiser's Deuteronomy 32 worldview, the Enochic teleology of evil, the incorporation and understanding of Paul's saying a lot here about supernatural evil and how that plays a role in human depravity. I think that's the better direction to go to truly understand what Paul's really getting at in Romans chapter 1 when he talks about men sleeping with men, women sleeping with women. And as a result, we can have better conversations in our churches today when we take in and try to understand how ancient Jews and Christians thought using Heiser's Deuteronomy 32 worldview as our lens and framework to read Paul here in Romans 1.
Well, there you have it.
All right, I'm done. Because I got a class soon. But thanks for watching all the way to the end. Hope you like this. I hope to come out with another video soon about Robertson's new book and his chapter on Romans 1 as well. But until then, we will see you next time. See you later.
And I stand by my performance.
He shall.